On December 19, 1944, in a frozen forest near Bastogne, Belgium, Captain Klaus Hoffmann of the Wehrmacht's 26th Volksgrenadier Division did something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He read a dead man's diary. That simple act, opening a blood-stained notebook found in the pocket of a fallen American medic, shattered everything he thought he knew about the war, about his enemy, and about himself. But to understand why those words devastated him so completely, we need to go back 6 years earlier, to a very different Klaus Hoffmann. In 1938, Klaus Hoffmann was 22 years old, a medical student at the University of Heidelberg, and utterly unremarkable. He wasn't a Nazi Party member, though his father was, a minor bureaucrat who joined early, not out of ideological fervor but because it helped his career. Klaus himself was apolitical, focused on his studies, dreaming of becoming a rural doctor like his grandfather. His girlfriend Anna teased him about being too serious, always buried in anatomy textbooks while other students drank beer and argued politics in smoky cafes. When war broke out in September 1939, Klaus felt nothing resembling enthusiasm. He watched his classmates rush to enlist, caught up in the propaganda and promises of quick victory, but Klaus hesitated. He wanted to finish his degree. He wanted to marry Anna. He wanted a normal life. By 1940, normalcy was no longer an option. Klaus received his conscription notice in March. Anna cried when he told her. His father clapped him on the shoulder and said it was his duty. Klaus reported to basic training feeling neither proud nor afraid, just resigned to an interruption he hoped would be brief. The training was brutal but straightforward. Klaus learned to shoot, to march, to obey without question. His medical background caught the attention of his superiors, and he was fast-tracked to officer training. By August 1941, Lieutenant Klaus Hoffmann found himself assigned to the 26th Infantry Division, preparing for Operation Barbarossa's continuation into Soviet territory. Russia changed him, not all at once, but gradually, like frostbite creeping through exposed flesh. The first time Klaus shot a man, a Soviet soldier no older than himself, stumbling through snow near Smolensk, he vomited afterward. The second time was easier. By the 100th, he'd stopped counting. The Eastern Front wasn't war as Klaus had imagined it. It was chaos, brutality, and cold so intense it shattered rifle bolts. Men froze standing up. Horses died in their traces. Entire battalions vanished into white nothing. Klaus saw things he couldn't write to Anna about, things he couldn't even acknowledge to himself. In his diary, a small leather journal Anna had given him, now stained with mud and blood, Klaus wrote carefully sanitized accounts. Heavy fighting today, lost 3 men, weather improving. He never mentioned the village his unit burned. He never wrote about the civilians his fellow officers shot. He developed a mental separation. There was the war he lived, and the war he reported. The gap between them grew wider with each passing month. By 1943, Klaus had been promoted to captain. He'd earned an Iron Cross for bravery, though he couldn't remember exactly what he'd done to deserve it. Everything blurred together, advances, retreats, desperate winter battles, brief summer offensives. Anna's letters came irregularly. She spoke of air raids, rationing, her work at a factory. She asked when he was coming home. Klaus had stopped promising anything. The propaganda kept telling them they were winning, even as they retreated. Klaus stopped believing, but he kept fighting. What else could he do? Desertion meant execution. Surrender meant Soviet prison camps, which everyone knew were death sentences. So he led his men, followed orders, and tried not to think too deeply about any of it. When Germany pulled forces back from the Eastern Front to prepare for the Western defense, Klaus felt relieved. Fighting the Americans and British seemed almost civilized compared to the savage desperation of Russia. The Western Allies followed rules, or so everyone said. They took prisoners. They didn't burn villages. This would be a different kind of war. He was wrong, but not in the way he expected. The Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last desperate offensive through the Ardennes, began on December 16, 1944. Klaus's division was part of the Northern Assault, tasked with capturing key road junctions and disrupting American supply lines. Intelligence briefings painted the Americans as soft, unprepared, and likely to collapse quickly under determined attack. The first day seemed to confirm this. American positions fell back. Klaus's unit advanced through abandoned foxholes and half-eaten meals, finding evidence of hasty retreats. Some of his men laughed, collecting American cigarettes and chocolate as prizes. Just like Poland, one sergeant said, they'll break. But by the second day, the American resistance stiffened. These weren't panicked troops fleeing in disorder. They were fighting with grim determination, giving ground only when forced, counterattacking whenever possible. Klaus began noticing something else: the American wounded. His unit overran several aid stations, and what he saw there troubled him. The American medics stayed with their wounded even when their positions were overrun. They didn't flee. They raised their hands, showed their Red Cross armbands, and asked, in broken German, for their patients to be treated with respect. Klaus ordered his men to leave them alone, not out of compassion particularly, but because it seemed tactically pointless to interfere with enemy medical personnel who'd already been neutralized. On December 18th, Klaus's company got into a vicious firefight near a small crossroads. The Americans fought from a snow-covered ridge, their fire disciplined and accurate. Klaus's forward platoon took heavy casualties trying to flank them. When darkness fell, both sides pulled back to reassess. In the morning, Klaus led a patrol to recover German casualties from no man's land. That's when they found the American aid station, or what remained of it. A mortar round had landed nearby, collapsing half of the makeshift shelter. 3 American bodies lay in the snow, their Red Cross armbands bright against the white ground. Klaus's sergeant wanted to leave them. "We have our own dead to recover," he said. But Klaus, perhaps because of his old medical training, perhaps because something in him needed to see these enemies as human, ordered his men to check the bodies. They're non-combatants. They deserve proper treatment. The first body was a chaplain, his helmet still bearing its cross insignia. The second was an aid man, whose pack was filled with bandages and morphine. The third was different. He was young, maybe 20, and his pockets contained more than medical supplies. There was a photo of a girl, a half-written letter, and a small diary bound in cracked leather. Klaus should have left it. He had orders to move out, enemy positions to scout, men depending on his leadership. But something made him slip that diary into his coat pocket. Maybe it was the photo. The girl looked a little like Anna. Maybe it was simple curiosity about what American soldiers wrote in their private moments. That night, in abandoned Belgian farmhouse serving as temporary headquarters, Klaus finally opened the diary. His English wasn't perfect, but it was good enough. He'd studied it in university, thinking it might be useful for reading medical journals. Now it served a very different purpose. The diary belonged to Private Michael Sullivan, from a small town in Iowa that Klaus had never heard of. The entries started in June 1944, just after D-Day. Sullivan's handwriting was neat, almost childlike, and his observations were remarkably detailed. The first entries were what Klaus expected: complaints about weather, food, boredom. Sullivan described his training, his fellow medics, his fears about combat. Normal soldier concerns. Klaus almost put the diary down, feeling like he was intruding on something private and pointless. Then he read the entry from August 15, 1944. "Treated my first German prisoner today. He was maybe 17, shot in the leg, crying for his mother. I kept thinking, what if he's one of the guys who shot at us yesterday? What if he killed Jimmy? But then I looked at him, really looked, and all I saw was a kid. Same as me, same as my brother back home. Doc says that's the hardest part of this job. You can't hate them when they're bleeding. I gave him morphine. He said danke. I learned that word now. It means thank you. Funny thing to learn in a war." Klaus read that passage 3 times. He tried to imagine a Wehrmacht medic treating an American prisoner with such, what was the word? Empathy? No, something simpler. Humanity. He kept reading. September 3rd. "We pulled back 3 wounded Germans today. Captain said to leave them. We had our own casualties to evacuate. But Doc Carson refused. He said the Hippocratic Oath doesn't have a nationality clause. We carried them 2 miles to the aid station. One of them died on the way. He was holding my hand when it happened. I don't even know his name. September 27th. Found a dead German soldier today. He had a photo in his pocket, wife and 2 kids. I wanted to keep it, to send it back somehow, so his family would know he had it with him at the end. But there's no system for that. No way to tell an enemy's family that he died thinking of them. I left it in his pocket. Maybe someone will bury him properly and find it. October 12th. Sometimes I wonder if the Germans have medics like us. Do they have guys who signed up thinking they'd save lives instead of taking them? Do they stay up at night wondering if they did enough? Do they remember the faces of everyone who died in their arms? Klaus felt something crack inside his chest. This wasn't enemy propaganda. This was a private diary, never meant to be read by German eyes. These were honest thoughts from a man who'd been trying to heal Klaus's own soldiers. He turned to the final entry, dated December 17, 1944, 2 days earlier. Heavy fighting all day. We're surrounded or near enough. Lost Parker and Rodriguez. They were hit, bringing in casualties under fire. I keep thinking about that German kid from August, wondering if he made it home, wondering if his leg healed right. Doc says I think too much, that I need to focus on our guys. But how do you turn off seeing people as people, even when they're trying to kill you, even when you're supposed to hate them? Anna asked me in her last letter if I've changed. I told her no. I lied. I've changed completely. I've seen what's under all the uniforms and flags. Just people, scared people trying to survive, thinking about home, missing their families. I don't know how to unknow that. I don't know how to stop seeing them as human. The entry ended there, mid-thought, as if Sullivan had been interrupted, probably by the attack that killed him. Klaus closed the diary. His hands were shaking. He sat there in the cold farmhouse, listening to his men snore and cough, and felt the full weight of 6 years crash down on him at once. Michael Sullivan had seen German soldiers, Klaus's soldiers, maybe even Klaus himself, as human beings, even while they were trying to kill him, even while he watched his friends die. This young American medic had performed an act of radical empathy that Klaus, with all his education and supposed civilization, had never even attempted. When had Klaus stopped seeing Soviet soldiers as people? When had he accepted the burning villages, the executed civilians, the casual cruelty as just how things were? When had he traded his humanity for survival? The diary forced him to confront an unbearable truth. He'd spent 6 years dehumanizing his enemies to make killing them easier, while somewhere on the other side, men like Michael Sullivan had spent their war desperately trying to remain human despite everything. Klaus thought about the letters he'd written to Anna, the sanitized reports that mentioned nothing of what he'd really done, really seen. He told himself he was protecting her. Now he wondered if he'd been protecting himself, maintaining the lie that he was still the man she'd loved, the medical student who wanted to heal people. He opened his own diary and tried to write. The pen hovered over the page for long minutes. Finally he wrote, "Today I read an enemy's diary. I learned that the Americans have medics who show mercy to German wounded. I learned that at least one man on the other side tried to stay human. I don't know what to do with this information. I don't know how to unknow what I now know." He paused, then added, "I think I've been fighting the wrong enemy, not the Americans, myself. The part of me that stopped questioning, stopped feeling, stopped seeing people as people." The next morning, Klaus's commanding officer gave him new orders. Advance toward Bastogne, engage enemy positions, take no prisoners if it slowed the offensive. Standard wartime orders. Klaus had followed such orders hundreds of times before. This time he hesitated. The colonel noticed. "Is there a problem, Captain Hoffmann?" Klaus looked at the map, at the marked enemy positions, and thought about Michael Sullivan, about the German soldiers Sullivan had treated, about the humanity Sullivan had maintained despite everything. "No, sir," Klaus said. "No problem." But there was a problem. A massive one. Klaus could no longer separate the war he lived from the war he acknowledged. The gap had closed, and the view was devastating. Over the next week, as the Battle of the Bulge ground toward German defeat, Klaus did something unprecedented in his military career. He hesitated. When his unit overran American positions, he checked for wounded carefully. When prisoners were taken, he ensured they were treated correctly. When a young lieutenant suggested executing captured Americans to save time and supplies, Klaus refused so vehemently that the lieutenant didn't raise the subject again. His men noticed the change but said nothing. On the Eastern Front, Klaus had been efficient, cold, mechanical. Here, he seemed distracted, almost reluctant. Some wondered if he'd lost his nerve. Others thought he was simply exhausted. None guessed the truth. Their captain was having a moral reckoning in the middle of a battle. On December 26th, Klaus's unit was surrounded near Bastogne. The Americans, reinforced and resupplied, had turned the tide. Klaus could see the end coming. Germany would lose this battle, probably the war. It was just a matter of time. That night he gathered his men, about 40 soldiers, mostly teenagers and old men, the depleted remnants of what had once been a formidable company. They waited in a destroyed barn, expecting American attack at dawn. Klaus made a decision. He told his men they would surrender at first light. No heroic last stand, no pointless deaths. They would lay down their weapons, raise white flags, and hope the Americans treated prisoners better than the Soviets did. A few men protested. One sergeant called it cowardice. Klaus let him speak, then said quietly, "I've read the diary of an American medic. He wrote about treating German wounded with the same care as his own. He died trying to save lives in this battle. If there are Americans like that, I'd rather surrender to them than die for a war that's already lost." The sergeant had no answer to that. None of them did. When dawn came, Klaus personally carried the white flag. His men lined up behind him, weapons on the ground, hands raised. American soldiers approached cautiously, fingers on triggers, expecting a trick. Klaus called out in English, "We surrender. We have wounded. We need medical assistance." An American lieutenant approached, covering Klaus with a rifle. "You speak English?" "Yes. I studied in university. I was a medical student before the war." "That right?" The American looked at Klaus's insignia, his Iron Cross. "You're an officer. Why surrender now?" Klaus hesitated, then pulled Sullivan's diary from his coat pocket. "I read this. It belonged to one of your medics. He died near here a week ago." The American lieutenant took the diary, opened it, recognized the handwriting. His face changed. "You knew Sully?" "No. I found his body. I read his diary. I learned—" Klaus struggled to find the words. "I learned that some men stay human even in war. I decided I should try to do the same." The American lieutenant was quiet for a long moment. Then he lowered his rifle. "I knew him. Sullivan. Good guy. Saved a lot of lives." He looked at Klaus with something between respect and confusion. "Why'd you keep his diary?" "Because it reminded me of who I used to be, before Russia, before all of this. It reminded me that the enemy is human." The American nodded slowly. "Yeah. Well, you're prisoners now, but I'll make sure your wounded get treated." Sullivan would have wanted that. Klaus Hoffmann spent the rest of the war in a POW camp in England, then France. The conditions were adequate, far better than German camps, especially for Russian prisoners. He was repatriated to Germany in 1947, returning to a country he barely recognized. Anna had survived the war, but their relationship hadn't. She'd become a different person, hardened by years of bombing and rationing. Klaus had become someone else too. The gap between who they'd been and who they'd become was unbridgeable. They parted without rancor, but without love either. Klaus finished his medical degree in 1950. He became a doctor, working in rural clinics in Bavaria, exactly as he'd once dreamed. But the work was shadowed by what he'd done, what he'd failed to do, during the war. In 1963, Klaus received an unexpected letter. It was from Iowa, from a woman named Margaret Sullivan. She explained that she was Michael Sullivan's sister. She'd been going through family papers and found correspondence from the army, mentioning that her brother's diary had been recovered and was being held for the family. She asked Klaus, who'd signed the prisoner processing forms transferring the diary to American authorities, if he remembered her brother, if he knew anything about his last days. Klaus wrote back. The letter took him 3 weeks to compose. He told her everything, finding the diary, reading it, how it had changed him, how it had probably saved his life and the lives of his men. He tried to explain what her brother's words had meant to a German officer who'd lost his way. Margaret wrote back 6 months later. Her letter was short. "Thank you for telling me this. It helps to know that Michael's decency mattered, even to someone on the other side. He wouldn't want to be remembered as a hero, just as someone who tried to stay kind when everything pushed him to be cruel." It sounds like he succeeded. Klaus kept that letter until his death in 1989. He never married, never had children, never spoke publicly about the war. But he kept 2 diaries on his nightstand, his own wartime journal, and a photocopy of Michael Sullivan's that Margaret had sent him. In his final months, suffering from lung cancer, Klaus did something unusual. He gave an interview to a graduate student researching the Battle of the Bulge. He talked about finding Sullivan's diary, about the impact it had, about the choices it forced him to confront. The interviewer asked if Klaus considered himself a good man. Klaus thought for a long time before answering. "No," he finally said. "I participated in terrible things. I followed orders I should have refused. I stayed silent when I should have spoken. Reading that diary didn't absolve me of any of that, but it did something else. It showed me that even in war, some people manage to preserve their humanity. That was the real enemy, not the Americans, not the Russians. It was the part of ourselves that accepts cruelty as necessity." Michael Sullivan fought that enemy every day. "I only started fighting it when I read his words." "Do you think you won that fight?" the student asked. Klaus smiled faintly. "No one wins that fight. You just keep fighting it, every day for the rest of your life. That's what Sullivan taught me. That's what I've tried to do." He died 2 weeks later. Among his possessions, the executor found instructions. He wanted Sullivan's diary photocopy buried with him, along with a letter he'd written to Michael Sullivan's memory, apologizing for taking 6 years to understand what Sullivan had known all along, that the hardest part of war isn't staying alive, it's staying human. The story of Klaus Hoffmann and Michael Sullivan isn't about redemption. Klaus never claimed redemption, never sought forgiveness. It's about something more fundamental, the realization that the people trying to kill you are still people, that maintaining your humanity in war requires constant effort, that sometimes the enemy that defeats you is the one you carry inside yourself. Sullivan's diary survived the war and is now housed in the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. Researchers who've studied it note its unusual focus on the humanity of enemy soldiers, its lack of hatred despite the horror Sullivan witnessed. Klaus Hoffmann's diary sits in a military archive in Berlin. His entries from December 1944 onward show a marked change in tone, less mechanical reporting, more honest wrestling with moral questions. Historians debate what caused this change, though Hoffmann himself explained it clearly in his 1989 interview. 2 men, enemies by circumstance, never met in life, but through the accident of a diary surviving its owner, one man's determination to stay human reached across battle lines and reminded another man what he'd lost and what he might still reclaim. In the end, that's the untold story of war, not the battles won or lost, but the internal struggles fought by people trying to remain people when everything around them says they should become something less. Michael Sullivan died trying to save lives. Klaus Hoffmann read his words and remembered why lives were worth saving. In a war that consumed 60 million souls, that small moment of connection between enemies represents something profound, the indestructible human capacity for empathy, even in circumstances designed to destroy it. The question Sullivan posed in his last diary entry, "How do you turn off seeing people as people?" never found an answer, perhaps because it shouldn't be answered. Perhaps maintaining that question, refusing to accept easy dehumanization, is exactly what keeps us human when everything else tries to strip that humanity away. Klaus Hoffmann learned that lesson too late to change what he'd done, but he learned it, and he spent 44 years after the war trying to live by it. Not as penance, not as redemption, simply as recognition that Michael Sullivan was right. You can't unknow that people are people. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. You can only decide what you'll do with that knowledge. Klaus chose to remember, to carry Sullivan's diary, literally and metaphorically, for the rest of his life, to let a dead enemy's words guide him toward the man he should have been all along. That's the real battle of war, not the one fought with guns and tanks, the one fought in moments of choice between seeing enemies as human or seeing them as targets. Michael Sullivan fought that battle every day and never surrendered. Klaus Hoffmann lost that battle for 6 years, then read a diary, and spent the rest of his life trying to reclaim the ground he'd given up. Neither of them could change the war, but their story reminds us that even in war, some choices remain ours. Some humanity can be preserved. Some connection across enemy lines can still exist if we're brave enough to reach for it. In the frozen Belgian forest of December 1944, a German officer opened an American medic's diary and discovered his real enemy. It wasn't the men in different uniforms, it was the voice inside that said those men weren't men at all. That voice lies. Klaus Hoffmann learned that truth from Michael Sullivan's words. It's a lesson worth remembering, long after the war that taught it has faded into history.